Hello, class. This is the lecture for April 29th on Arab Spring. I hope you're all feeling well, holding up well in this time of trouble. And so I think what I'd like to say first about the Arab Spring is that it had a lot of similarities to the period I talked about earlier in the class, that is, following the union of Syria in Egypt in 1958, the creation of the United Arab Republic. There were demonstrations across the Arab world, both against monarchies and against any state that was seen as being sympathetic or in alliance with the United States. And so it was what the commentators at the time called the Arab nationalist moment. It was when young Arabs poured out onto the street to show their disaffection. At that time, they had been mobilized by what was the major media outlet of the time, which was the Voice of the Arabs, which was the radio station from Cairo, which was listened, I think, probably by almost every Arab who had a radio was listening to the Voice of the Arabs at that time. And there was a survey done by one of the first people to do popular opinion in the Arab world was a guy named Lerner at Columbia. And he had a quote that was often repeated at the time, and it was by a Bedouin leader. And he was asked about the Palestinians, and he replied, "The Palestinians, they listened to the radio, and God destroyed them." So that was, an attitude of conservative Arabs toward the media of the radio. And so that ended with that period ended with the establishment of the military dictatorships that dominated the Arab world from roughly the 60s, early 60s, on through the present, or at least to Arab Spring. And Arab Spring then broke out as a series of discontents of Arab population toward their governments. And ironically, it was those same governments that had come to power with the enthusiasm of the Arab nationalist movement in 1958 and the early 60s. By the 2000s, that had all disseminated. It was gone. There was Islamist movement had started to take hold, and some of the discontent Arabs were feeling was channeled into the Islamist movements. But there were also a lot of young Arab men and women who were highly educated. One of the things the nationalist governments did do was to open up university education to people who were well qualified, who had done well in high school. And so there were large numbers of people who were very well educated, but who had no job opportunities. And the Arab world itself, in terms of population, was growing very fast. Syria in 2010, over half the population was under the age of 25. And so you had a large population of young people who really felt that the states were not delivering economically, but also were political and politically repressive. And so when the newsmen went on the streets and asked the people, "Why are you doing this?" Economic grievances were very high on the list that people gave, but also the whole idea of humiliation, that the state, in the form of police states, humiliated the people constantly. They were abused, physically tortured if they went to jail. And they just felt that that there was no future for them, either economically or politically. And so that they sort of shared with the generation, would have been their parents or grandparents even in 1958. That was also a time of despair, but it was also a time of optimism in 58. In other words, in 58, the Arabs thought they were going to, young people who were demonstrating, I should say, the young Arabs who were demonstrating, felt that they were going to bring in a new age of nationalism, and that would cure the region's ills, that there would be greater unity among the Arab nations, and that would they'd stand up against the West. Well, in 2011, there were very few political aspirations beyond the fact that they wanted to better their situation, and that they felt that they just couldn't take it anymore. And there were two common slogans that were picked up and used across the Arab world. One was Kefaya. Kefaya means enough. It's the Arabic equivalent, Spanish, or Italian, they both use it. Basta, it's the equivalent of basta, Kefaya. And it's an Egyptian expression, but it's also used in Syria and Palestine as well. And every Arab, even if they're not Egyptians or Syrians, they understand it because they've seen the Egyptian movies. So Kefaya, enough. And the other was Yaskut al-Nizam, let the regime fall. And here they use the word Nizam. And I pointed out that I thought it was kind of ironic when I gave the lecture on Iran, that Iran calls their government the Nizam. Well, in Arabic, Nizam generally means organization, often shadowy organization, like the mafia is the Nizam. But they were using it, they weren't saying the regular word for government, which is hukuma. They weren't saying hukuma, they were saying Nizam, let the Nizam fall, let the illegal organization fall. And so that was the chants that were picked up. Now, how did it spread? And that's if the symptoms were pretty much universal, that is the republics, the so-called republics. And remember, in 2011, every Arab state was either a monarchy or a republic. And I have them listed for you. The monarchies are Morocco and Jordan, and then the states in the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia, and all the other states call themselves republics. But in 2011, there were only two of the republics, Arab republics, that had relatively free elections, and those were Lebanon, which we talked about, question how free it is, and Iraq. And that leads me to what will be the end of this lecture, and I labeled it the Arab Spring and the Arab Autumn, because in 2019, and up until the time that the coronavirus hit the Middle East, the demonstrations were still going on in exactly those two republics, Lebanon and Iraq. So I'll end with a discussion of that period. So go back to 2011. It starts in Tunisia. Tunisia was one of the, I would say, of the Arab republics, it was probably the most laissez-faire, in a sense that because much of its economy is based on tourism, it's open to the West. There's a large Tunisian population in France. Most Tunisians are very well educated. Most Tunisians are fluent in French as well as Arabic. So it was a country that was open to the West in a way that most other Arab countries weren't. But it also was a corrupt country. It was unique, though, in that we talk about the military regimes. The president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, was not from the military. He was from the Destour party, which had won Tunisia's independence from France in 1956. It had created itself as a party, a state party, so there was only one party. And it had what Ben Ali used, rather than the army, which he was very afraid of, and Tunisia had a very small army. So what he used was the police and the secret police. And so those people, the police, secret police, were well known for taking bribes and corruption. And the spark, so to speak, literally was a spark, was a fruit seller named Muhammaed Bouazizi in the town of Sidi Bouzid, which was not in the tourist belt. There's a lot of comments on the fact that interior Tunisia, away from the coast, was the area which was the hotbed of discontent because it had been so neglected. There was so little unemployment there. For example, when the Islamic State is created in Syria, Tunisia has the highest per capita number of people to go to join that Islamic State. And they came almost entirely from those rural hinterlands, inland from the Mediterranean coast. Anyway, so Bouazizi was pushing his vegetables and fruit into the market, and the police had said that he didn't pay his taxes, and they asked for bribes, and they then confiscated his fruits and vegetables, which that's all he had. He just had a push cart. And so he went home and he told his wife that he just couldn't stand it anymore. And he then poured kerosene on himself and set himself alight and died. Suicide is very unusual in the Muslim world. And so for someone to do that really literally was a spark that set off this demonstrations of the elite, of the educated elite in the capital. And they started demonstrating. And because there really wasn't much of a police state army in Tunisia, the police collapsed. I mean, they really could not. When the demonstrations started to get into the hundreds of thousands in Tunis, the regime collapsed very quickly. So the immolation took place on December 17th, 2010. And by January 14th, Zainuddin bin Ali, the president, fled to Saudi Arabia, and you then had a revolution. And the interesting that in the Middle East, I mean, we call it the Arab Spring, and that's the title of this lecture. That was a title that the Westerners used. The Middle Easterners themselves never used that term. It was in reference to what was known in the West as Prague Spring in 1968, which was when students and intellectuals had taken to the streets in Prague and demonstrating against the communist government there. That government had collapsed and a liberal communist had come to power. He was then crushed in the summer by the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. And so Prague Spring ended up in basically a bad summer when the Soviet army crushed it. So in the West, whenever people are revolting against communism or oppression, they often invoke spring. They use the metaphor of spring. In the Middle East, they were using the word thawra, revolution. And they called in Tunisia, they called it the Jasmine Revolution, partly because, flower grows in gardens all across the Middle East, but also it symbolizes a peaceful revolution. There wasn't violence. Jasmine is hardly a violent symbol. So they called it the Jasmine Revolution. Now, with this demonstrations and the going on in Tunisia, it's picked up, and here media is important, and the West, again, Western commentators made a very big emphasis on the role of Facebook and Twitter and how young Arab intellectuals and professionals and business people were communicating using those media, and those media were the ones that then generated the revolution. And I think historians of the period will say, yes, that did connect the intellectuals in various countries. And as I said, the population is very much skewed toward the young in the Arab countries. So 20 and 30-year-olds are the majority, and they're the ones who are very well educated, and they're the ones who are media savvy. And so they are using Facebook. WhatsApp wasn't really that much in use back then, but Facebook was. And so they were using Facebook to communicate with each other. But the real momentum, and this is what people at the time tended not to talk about, Western commentators tended not to talk about, because in a way it upended the narrative of heroic Western-oriented youth who are trying to save their system, create a future for themselves. And it's a democratic future. It's something we in the West, we saw it happening with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we cheered it on, and now we're going to cheer it on in the Arab countries. But in reality, the real force behind it, the media force behind it, was Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I'll repeat it. Al Jazeera is a cable TV station that was started by the royal family of Qatar, which is just basically an oil state, a mini oil state, but very rich. And it was started because CNN had dominated the cable news in the Arab world during the first war with Iraq, and CNN had remained most Arabs tuned into CNN. They would have to speak English, of course, but they would tune into CNN for their news. Cable, although it was banned, satellite dishes were banned in most of the repressive Arab countries like Syria. When I was in Syria in the 1990s, every apartment building had dishes. And by the time I was there in 2004, the hotel TV system had Al Jazeera. The first number one station was Al Jazeera. When you turned it on, number one was Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera started in, I think, 1995. And it had become a major outlet of pan-Arab and pan-Islamic, because the Sultan, the Sultan, whatever his title is, the monarch who runs, I'm not sure what title he uses, whether he uses Sheikh or, well, whatever it is. He is sympathetic to the Muslim Brothers. And so his television station had a lot of very prominent Sunni and Wahhabi preachers on it, giving talk shows. And so it promoted a very conservative kind of Islam, but it hated the military dictatorships, or they should say the monarch and his family hated the dictatorship. And so what they did is, rather than have, as I said, internet, it was the cell phone that created the revolution. Because by 2010, 2011, a large number of people in the Middle East had cell phones. They often skipped places that didn't have cable would have cell phones, because cell phone technology is much easier, cheaper. And so almost everybody had, or a large number of people had cell phones. The estimate in Egypt of people who had internet connections was only about 20% of the population was connected to the internet. But almost every family had at least one cell phone. And so what the phenomenon was that people would take cell phone videos of whatever was happening in their country and send it to, by cell phone, send it to Al Jazeera. And then Al Jazeera would, make them more professional looking and then show them on the news. So Al Jazeera every night started with a story. They had all the stories earlier had been, the first story of the night was usually from what they called occupied Palestine. The second story was from what they called occupied Iraq. And then, but during the Arab Spring, those stories took a back seat to the stories that were coming out about the revolutionary sorry about this. This is popped up my screen. The news then promoted these, and they would juxtapose what was happening in Tunisia to what was happening in Egypt, and then Syria, and then the various other countries that were involved by the Arab Spring. So, in other words, Al Jazeera served as the cheerleader for these. It made known what was happening, but it also, in its commentary, encouraged other Arabs to rise up against their nizams as well. And so it was very powerful media. And so what happens then is every country, there's slightly different turnout. And so our outcome, that's what I was looking for, outcome, is a different outcome. And what I wanted to do briefly is to talk through some of them and then talk more generally about the whole process, and then, as I said, end with the discussion of what happened this year. And the first is Tunisia. So we go back to Tunisia, and Tunisia had a opposition movement. It had, as I said, it had an intellectual movement, very many intellectuals. Tunisia was, like Iran, was taking the lead in the region in making films, and Tunisia produced some really wonderful cinema, not documentaries, but story fiction movies in the 2000s that were really quite sophisticated. So there was an intellectual elite in Tunis that was open to the West, but there also were the equivalent of the Muslim Brothers, and that was a movement that was called en-Nahda, which is the Arabic word for awakening. And that was led by an intellectual named Rached Ghannouchi. And he's on your list. He was in Paris. So some Tunisians, liberal Tunisians, viewed him as kind of the dark Khomeini, because just like Khomeini shows up from Paris, Ghannouchi comes in from Paris and announces that he's going to be the leader of the movement to create a new Tunisia. But Tunisia goes through a prolonged period where there's discussions, there's elections for first the writing of the Constitution, and then finally there was an election in 2014. And Ghannouchi's party, en-Nahda, is the leading, gets the most votes, but it doesn't get a majority. And what the intellectuals were kind of afraid was, they were afraid that, well, now that they're the leading party, they will take control, as many of the more liberal, non-religious Arabs would often said that Brotherhood says that they'll have their 4 elections, but once they win an election, there'll be no more elections. In other words, they will then impose a dictatorial regime. Well, Ghannouchi didn't do that. He was willing to cooperate with the democratic forces, and in Tunisia, it was kind of unique in the Arab world, and not only did it have a Western-oriented intellectual class, it also had a very strong labor union tradition. And the labor unions also then were not in favor of the Islamist kind of government. And then there was also women's movement in Tunisia. It was very sophisticated. Many of the movies I mentioned were created by women auteurs, filmmakers who wrote and directed the movies. And so there was women in Tunisia had been emancipated in a way much more, and that goes back to the founding of the Tunisian Republic. The founder was Habib Bourguiba, and he had ended polygamy and had given women full access to jobs and things like that. So the women's movement in Tunisia was also very active. And so the kind of combination of Western intellectuals, the labor union, the women's movement, something like the Berber movement, which is, Berbers are a small number in Tunisia, but they were also active in on the liberal side. They kind of kept it from going more Islamic. And then in 2017, the election, there was a new party called Nida Tunis, or the Call of Tunisia, and it won 38% of the seats, which was the largest number. And Tunisia has had troubles. I saw where the Freedom House in London ranks it as a semi-free democracy, but just not for you to think, well, they're just semi-free. United States is also in the semi-free category. Only Scandinavia and New Zealand and a few places get in the totally free category. But it has had trouble. They've had trouble with the Islamist movement. There was an attack on tourists in Tunisia a couple of years ago, and as I said, the number of Tunisians, not more than 1,000, but still disproportionately young Tunisians who have gone to fight in Syria, and also young Tunisian Islamists who have gone to Libya next door, which I'll talk to them about in just a minute. But to sum up on Tunisia, people looking at the Arab Spring, they see Tunisia as the only success story in the whole movement. Because what happened then in Egypt is, it looked on par. It looked like it was going to be like Tunisia. That is, the demonstration started in January when Ben Ali left Tunis, so that was given big press in Al Jazeera. And so the Egyptian activists started demonstrating, and by February 11th, Husni Mubarak had left. He didn't leave the country, but he left the presidency, and it looked like the revolution had succeeded in Egypt as well. Now, why? Why did that happen? And why was the fall of Mubarak actually fairly painless? There were these huge demonstrations in the largest square in Cairo is Tahrir, which means liberation. There were these huge demonstrations at Tahrir Square. The Egyptian government had tried the Iranian tactic of hiring thugs to attack the demonstrators. But overwhelmingly, the population turned out in these demonstrations. And one of the reasons it did is that the Muslim Brothers told its members to show up. So the demonstrations had started as, like in Tunis, had started with the Western educated elite, or the Western, not necessarily educated, but pro-Western, tech savvy elite, and also the women. Again, as in Tunisia, the women's movement was very active in the demonstrations in Cairo. But then the numbers, the fact that they could get 1 million people in Meydan Tahrir was because the brothers were showing up. The brothers had sent out, they had been quasi-legal from the time of Mubarak came to power as a way of kind of denting the Islamic extremists. So the brothers were allowed to not always be an official political party, but there were newspapers that were pro-brother, had brother sympathies that were being published, and radio stations and things like that. So they were active. They were probably the most active voice other than the regime. And all the more liberal voices, the political parties were banned, with the exception of the Waft, which was revived, but was mostly seen by the young as a bunch of old people. So there wasn't any political movement that they could channel, the young people could channel. And so gradually the brothers took over. They took over the movement. And the army then doesn't act. This is the other key. Why doesn't the army act? Well, one thing, the army is very well entrenched in Egypt. They have a similar deal as in Turkey. They have what's called the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, so the English translation of it. And that had a tremendous amount of power in the political regime. And the army had then profited. I mentioned that they own a good part of the GNP of Egypt is in the hands of military. Hotels, most of the hotels are owned by military officers. Cement production, bottled water production, that's all in the hands of the military. So the military has economic interest as well as military interest. The second thing about the army is that it's a conscript army. It's almost all Egyptian males serve in it. It's popular, like in Turkey. The army remains a popular institution for most Turks. It's a popular institution for most Egyptians. So Egypt the only major minority that the Egyptians have are Christians. So there's no Shia, there's no tribal issue as there was, say, in Iraq or in Syria. And so the army represents the Egyptian people. And so the popular rebellion seemed to be aimed at Mubarak and not at the army. And so the army itself, we think, was getting kind of edgy about Mubarak because Mubarak was grooming his son, Gamal, who was in his 40s at that time, who I think was an engineer or some kind of secular education. He wasn't a military guy. He was grooming Gamal to be his successor. And the army really saw Gamal as being the equivalent of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And they really did not want a dynastic regime in Egypt the way that the dynastic regime had emerged in Syria. And so the army really wasn't that supportive of Mubarak. And so they they basically told Mubarak they weren't going to support him. And the other possible prop for Mubarak was the United States. And of course, the United States at that time we had Barack Obama, and Barack Obama had gone, one of the first foreign things he had done after being elected president in 2009, he went to Egypt and gave this very famous speech about, opening the hand out to the Muslim people, and he was for democracy and blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, when the Arab Spring happens, he comes out in favor of the democratic movements in the Arab world. So he clearly sends a message to Mubarak that the United States is not going to support Mubarak continuing place in the head of Egypt. The military in Egypt lets the Americans know that they're going to guarantee their reliance on the United States. They're going to guarantee the treaty with Israel. And so the American military and the governmental forces are really sympathetic, or not necessarily sympathetic. They're not willing to invest anything in Mubarak. And so Mubarak reads the signals and he resigns. He goes to house arrest on a wonderful vacation home he has on the Red Sea. And later he'll be arrested and put in prison, but initially while the army isn't taking charge. So the army then says they are the caretakers. They're going to take care and make sure there's a transition to democracy. And so there is then a flurry of political activity. Parliament is elected in 2011. It is in the fall. It is a fairly hasty election that, as I said, the political parties had not been allowed to exist really before the fall of Mubarak. And so what happened is a large number of political parties are formed. I think there were something like, I don't remember the exact number, there was between 10 and 20 parties are on the ballot, and they represent from everywhere from extreme left to I don't think there was any monarchist, but there was definitely a Nasserite party, so a party that wanted to bring back the good old days of Nasser. But the ones who had the strength were the Islamic people, because they had been organizing all along. They were in the mosque. They had their own institutions. The brothers had in the 90s and the 2000s, their charity work was unquestionably, many Egyptians, the only food and medical care they're getting wasn't from the government. It was from the Muslim Brother Organization. And the Muslim Brother Organization, where they get their money, where they got it from often, a lot of it was funded by rich Arabs in the Gulf, whether they were Egyptian expatriates or whether they were rich Gulfi people who favored the Sunni kind of thing of the brothers. And so they had the resources, and they were in a good position, and they won. I think it was something like 2/3 of the seats in parliament, and they had created a new party that was called Freedom and Justice. And you think, wow, I heard something like that. Remember, in Turkey, there's justice and development. Well, this is freedom and justice, and clearly they had modeled themselves after the AK Party in Turkey, and surprise, surprise, Erdogan in Turkey comes out very strongly in favor of this movement in Egypt, and he compliments them, and okay, and so then they have a presidential election in 2012, and the man who was elected president, they had runoffs, and there were only 2 people running by the time they did. The army said only 2 people could run from the runoff. And one was a guy who was associated with Mubarak. He had been the interim president and had been chosen by the army because he was from there. Basically, he wasn't an army guy himself, but he was in their pocket. And they allowed Mohamed Morsi, who was the head of the newly formed Freedom and Justice Party, but which was the brothers. And he won then. He won by a big majority, but he did win. But the interesting thing was the only other party that did well were the Salafis. And so the Salafis, by this time, they had broken with the brothers. The brothers are still following in the Hassan al-Banna mode, that they are through the ballot box, they'll take control, whereas the Salafis are following more of the Qutb model. Remember, Qutb had been the head of the brothers, but then after he was imprisoned and then came out with his signpost on the road book about radical overthrow of Muslim states, the brothers broke, and the more radical brothers then started being called Salafis. And so the minority, so if you look at the parliament, go back to the parliament elected in 2011, the vast majority of the members of parliament were either Muslim brothers or to the right of the Muslim brothers. So it was a pretty scary parliament to many of the intellectuals and liberals who had brought about or started the risings that led to the overthrow or to the collapse of the Mubarak regime. So Morsi gets elected in 2012, in June of 2012, and I was in Egypt in November of 2012, and then at that point he put in a new constitution. He had the overwhelming majority of the parliament, so he could change the thing, and he gave the president right to control the judiciary. And that really set off alarm bells. There was major demonstrations while I was there in Cairo. People shut down Cairo in opposition to this new constitution. And there were open clashes then between people who were the brothers. And so typically you get the, jean wearing guys, women without headscarves, very westernized looking young people out there demonstrating for greater democratic freedoms, and then they would be attacked by guys with beards who were clearly the brothers. So that schism in Egyptian society opened up. It had well, let's say it collapsed or had disappeared when there was the movement toward overthrowing the Mubarak regime. But once the Mubarak regime was overthrown, or collapsed, I wouldn't say collapsed, the split between those who were the secular, the center and the left, and the more Islamist group. And so Morsi then represented the Islamist group. And so that spring, there was a lot of demonstrations, there was a lot of unease. And then in June of 2013, and then we'll talk about June in 2013 again when I talk about the Syrian civil war next in that last lecture. That's a very critical time in the Syrian civil war. And Morsi, who has welcomed Erdogan. Erdogan had come to Egypt, given a couple of speeches, and congratulated Egypt on its path toward democracy and all this kind of thing. And then Morsi then had this big rally in Alexandria on the anniversary of his election, first year of his election. And among the people there were people from the Syrian, the Islamic Front in Syria. And he at one point in his speech said that Egyptians were free to leave Egypt. They could go anywhere they wanted to go. And the army took this to mean that he was encouraging young Egyptians to go to Syria to fight on the side of the Islamic Front. And they took that as not something they wanted. Because remember, they had promised, the military had promised the American military and Obama that they would make sure that Egypt stayed true to its alliance with the United States. Morsi, although ironically he had a degree from the University of Southern California, graduate degree, I think in engineering, he clearly was taking the anti-American line, an anti-Israeli line as well. So the army was uneasy, and then on July the 3rd, 2013, they basically staged a coup against him and removed him and put him in prison. They then had an election in 2014, which was a sham. There was the Abdul-Fattah, al-Sisi was the general. He says, I'm not a general anymore, I'm a politician. He got something like 99% of the vote. So it's back to where, back in Nasser times and Sadat times, where 99% of the people vote for it. But in truth, and maybe it was true that 99%, because it was less than a third of the people showed up to vote. And so it was possible that the middle class, who were afraid of the Muslim Brother government, and also the Christians, because under Morsi, the attacks by the extreme Muslim groups against Christian churches had increased, and there were a number of cases where Christian churches were bombed and Christians were killed by Islamic extremists. So the Christian population also, which is about 10% of Egypt, they looked to the army as their savior as well. So it is possible that 99% of the people who voted for Sisi, just because of the fact that the turnout was so low. That there was, as I said, when I was in Egypt before this coup, it was clear that the people the best educated people, the people who spoke English, and the people who were in the tourist industry, and then a couple of the journalists that I talked with, they were not sympathetic to Morsi. And so they had soured on the revolution. They thought that the revolution had brought the wrong people to power. So that has been then the case. Egypt has been under a military dictatorship since 2014. Initially, under Obama, America cut military aid to Egypt. That was restored once Trump came to power. And so the relations between the Egyptian military and the American military are again strong, and it's a dictatorship, and it has resorted to some of the worst kinds of imprisonment and torture that were used under Mubarak. And so some people would say, well, nothing really changed, that the brief experiment in democracy showed us that this would be some Egyptian intellectual would say that the brief experiment in democracy showed us we weren't ready for democracy, that we have to endure a military regime because the alternative is an Islamist state. And of course, what was happening in Syria with talking about the whole anarchy and the terrible things that the Islamic State was doing in Syria and later in Iraq led people in moderates in the Arab world to say, well, if it's a choice between the army and the choice of the Islamist, I'll take the army. And so Egypt and the economy in Egypt has really just done terribly since then. I predicted, well, I don't know what will happen in Egypt. I mean, the Egyptians tend not to be a very violent people, so that maybe that helps the regime stay in power, because the Egyptians tend not to be revolutionary extremists in their own personal way of thinking of the world. So I don't know, but anyway, it hasn't been a success story. So we'll go there to Libya, which is the other really probably, well, one of the worst. Well, there are two really bad stories that come out of the Arab Spring are Libya and Syria. And as I said, Syria, because it gives rise to the Islamic State and the whole crisis of the currently see in the Middle East. I'll talk about that, Syria, on the last lecture. But in Libya, what you have then is you have a very, looking back on it, I just think that Gaddafi, I mean, he was a megalomaniac. There's no question about it. He's flamboyant. He wore all kind of bizarre clothing. He actually wrote a pornographic novel that was published in Beirut. He was just a very strange individual. And among his conceits was that he was the king of kings of Africa. And so under his regime, a lot of the money that in oil, Libya was incredibly rich oil-wise. And I just wonder why he didn't spend it on his own people, because he had the ability, with Libya's relatively small population, much smaller than Saudi Arabia, he could have spent the money that he wasted in Africa on various grandiose projects. He could have spent that money in Libya and created a welfare state. And I doubt then there would have been a revolution. But he didn't do that. He used his money, like I said, in very grandiose things, among which to build a large air force and army. But it was manned by mercenaries from Africa. He didn't trust Libyans other than people from his own tribe. He was from a Bedouin tribe and in the town of Sirte. And he just didn't trust Libyans. And so his inner circle were the people from his tribe, and then his military forces were basically these African mercenaries. So he really did not have a strong base. And so when the opposition started in Libya, they started demonstrations very early because Libya is next door to Tunisia. And so the people in Libya started demonstrating. They brought out the old flag that had been the flag of the monarchy. And Gaddafi then responded very brutally. And the country basically broke apart. There are two main regions. There's a region of Tripoli, which is in the west, centered around the city of Tripoli. And then there's the region that is called in the Western languages, going back to the ancient Romans and Greek, Cyrenaica, which is the eastern part of Libya, which is next to Egypt. And its largest city is Benghazi, or what the Arabs call Benghazi. So Benghazi and Tripoli, in between is the Gulf of Libya. And so the two only little green parts in Libya are in the mountains and on the Mediterranean coast where Tripoli is, and then there's mountains on the Mediterranean coast where Benghazi is, and the rest of the country pretty much is desert. And so they split. They had historically been the two regions, although they had been united under the Ottomans. There had always been, the people in the east were very different from the people in the west, and so they basically split. And so you had a former Libyan general who had been in Gaddafi's army, but then had gone to Europe and exiled, General Haftar, Haftar. He organized defense units in Benghazi to defend it, because what happened is that Gaddafi basically started to take back. Almost every town in Libya had its own revolutionary council. And so his army started to take them back. The one area he did not take is the mountains behind Tripoli are inhabited by Berber people. And they basically set up their own militias, and because it's mountainous and they knew the terrain, they were able to resist state independence, and they are still relatively independent up there in those mountains. So he's moving, Gaddafi's army is moving across Libya, following down the Gulf of Libya, and he is saying all kind of terrible things. He's going to exterminate the population of Benghazi. The Europeans get really excited. And it's ironic because why are they excited? They're excited because they think that if Libya collapses, hundreds of thousands of Libyans will come to Europe. So why do I say that's ironic? Is because Libya does collapse and hundreds of thousands of people do come to Europe. They're not from Libya, they're from Africa. But it opens the doors to immigration. But at the time, the European, especially France and Italy, were convinced that if Libya fell, that then the Libyan population would basically decamp and come to Europe. So they passed a UN resolution, which was, let's see if I have the number there. The number was 1973, should be an easy one to remember. 1973, and that said that it allowed NATO to use its forces to keep Libya from killing its civilians, which is interesting because they don't do that for Syria. Syria is killing its civilians in much larger numbers than Libya ever did. But of course, the Soviet Union, I'm sorry, Russia, isn't aware. In fact, some people say it became aware. It became much more defensive about Syria because of this resolution. So this is 2011, and by 2013, as we'll see in the Syrian civil war, that's when the Russians come in and they start blocking all UN attempts to stop the fighting. So in 2011, the Russians just stood back, and they said it's NATO's problem. And America didn't want to. Obama, obviously, his whole thing was to get out of the Middle East. Obama didn't want to get involved. And so Obama said to the French and the Italians, you can do it, and we'll give you the intelligence. So we'll use our military spy satellites, and we'll give you all the military intelligence. So basically, the ragtag army that Gaddafi had, which was, as I said, made up mostly of African mercenaries, a very little, he did have some jets, but they were all shot down very quickly. They basically destroyed his army, the Italians and the French destroyed his army. He was then, the rebels were able to overturn him. He was captured and killed in August 2011, very brutally killed. And the country split. The animosities that had been there, tribal, because most Libyans, like Iraqis, are still tribally organized. They identify with tribes. And the competition between the only two cities in the country, Tripoli and Benghazi, was intense. And so you now have a situation that's been going on since 2011, where there's a civil war in Libya between these two forces. The one government in Tripoli was democratically elected. There was a constitution written. There were elections. And that's recognized by the United Nations and the United States. There is the General Haftar regime in Benghazi, which is recognized by Russia, Egypt, interesting, Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And those three countries are giving military support to it. So last year, it looked like Haftar was going to take Tripoli, and Turkey then intervened. So Turkey has emerged in this, trying to, we'll see it does similarly in Syria, that it sees the Arab Spring had been their hope that somehow the Arab states would move toward a more Islamic kind of government and therefore be aligned with Turkey. And so Turkey was very sympathetic to, especially to Morsi, but also to Ghannouchi in Tunisia and to the regime in Tripoli, which isn't as Islamist as Morsi, but is Islamic enough for Turkey. And Turkey's role has been, Turks sent troops and military equipment in last fall, and that kept Tripoli from falling to Haftar. So it's an ongoing situation in Libya, and it's just really a shame because it should be one of the richest countries in the Middle East because of its oil reserves. All right, that leads us to the oil countries, and they had their own way of dealing with it. It's interesting that the countries that were least affected by the Arab Spring were Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait. And the argument has been they all had legitimate governments in the sense that the monarchies were recognized by the majority of the people as being legitimate and therefore um, not as questionable as these military regimes. It also, all three of them are relatively pro-Western, pro-United States, pro-France, and those countries have been pushing them so that although there are monarchies in all three of the countries, there has been moves toward democracy, most in Kuwait. And Kuwait, the Sheikh of Kuwait is very limited political power. In Jordan and in Morocco, the kings have more power, but they also have opened up the political sphere to political parties, opposition parties. They control them so that they don't get the majority of the seats, but they do allow, there is voice. And so people have said that that was part of the reason. I would say also that there is the fear factor, especially in Jordan, that when they look north to see what's happening in Syria or east to see what's happening in Iraq, they don't want that to happen to them. And so they're willing to put up with lesser freedoms. As I said, in Saudi Arabia, what the Saudis did is they were faced with trouble from the Shiite areas, and they repressed those very bloodily, and they arrested many of the leading Shia clerics in what's called in Saudi Arabia the Eastern Province, where the oil fields are, and they arrested many of them, and some of them were tortured. And then they did what they often do. They opened up the spigot. They remember most Saudi citizens, if they work, if they're not in business, they're employees of the state, and the Saudi government upped the salaries of all of its employees in 2011 by 25%. So they basically bought the loyalty of the Saudi population by giving them better salaries. So they were able to manage that. Now, the area that gave them the real trouble was in the neighboring island nation of Bahrain, which is ruled by a family that are Sunnis, but the majority of the people are Shia. And they started their demonstrations along the same time as the demonstrations in Egypt and then in Syria. And they were then crushed by the Saudi army. The Saudis had built a causeway from Bahrain to connecting the Saudi mainland. And so they just basically came across with their tanks and suppressed the rebellion. Again, it wasn't, the number of people killed wasn't above a couple of hundred, but there were significant, the leadership of the opposition movement was all in prison. Some of them were killed by the Saudis. But that it was suppressed bloodily. Then the last place where there was the trouble was in Yemen. And in Yemen, there had been a civil war brewing for a long time. The northern part of Yemen is the majority of the people there are Shia. They're not the same kind of Shia as in Iran. But as I mentioned in the growth of politicized Shia, the Iranians started cultivating them in the early 20th century, or part of the 21st century. And this group is called the Houthis because the leader of the group was a guy named al-Houth. And so they're called the Houthis. So the Houthis are basically tribes people from the northern part of Yemen who are Zaydi Shia. Yemen used to be ruled by a monarch who was the imam, who was the Zaydi imam. And he was overthrown by the military revolution in 1962, the one that was backed by Nasser. And at that point, remember, Yemen joined the United Arab Republic. But the Shia then have resented the military. The military tends to, in Yemen, comes from the Sunni part of the population. And so they had been rebelling against the general, Saleh. But when Saleh was overturned by so-called democratic forces, interestingly, he then went and joined the Houthis. And so in Yemen, since 2011, there's been a civil war. The Houthis have won the majority of the countryside. They control Sana'a and Taiz, the larger towns in the north, the port of Hudaybiya. The so-called Democrats, the people on the side of the Republic, have been basically confined to the south. And over the weekend, there was then the report that Southerners they were an independent country. They had been a British colony, got independence in the 1960s, and then they had joined with northern Yemen in 1991. And so they had a tradition of having their own government, and they now are pushing for, again, independence from the the very beleaguered supposedly democratic forces. And so Saudi Arabia and UAE have been helping the so-called democratic forces against the Houthis. And that war has become very much politicized because the Iranians then have said, trying to convince the Houthis that they should become Imam Shia, they should accept them. But that hasn't happened yet. It's still, it's a confused muddle. And it's again something that Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been responsible for, and he has not done a very good job. So that I'm going to leave the Arab Spring then. So basically, outside of Tunisia, the Arab Spring turned into, as somebody once said, the Arab nuclear winter. In other words, it really just did not go well. And some countries like Yemen, Libya, and Syria are still in the midst of civil war from it. But I wanted to talk about I'm not as pessimistic as some other people are about the whole thing, because I do think that it left a memory in people's minds of the possibility of change. And so we have then, interestingly, what I just made up, called it the Arab Autumn, which was last fall. And there, in both Lebanon and Iraq, similar situations as economic situations that led to the Arab Spring led to demonstrations. But there's a twist to it, which I find very interesting. And that twist is that in both cases, the young people, besides wanting jobs and wanting economic opportunities, are saying that they are tired of sectarianism. They are tired of the politics of parties, that the parties are constituted by what religious group they belong to, or in the case of Iraq, also then the Kurdish parties. So the Kurdish parties are Sunni parties, or Shia parties. And they say, well, we don't want that. We want parties that transcend sectarian. And in Lebanon, they've been calling for the end of the sectarian identity cards. Remember I told you that in Lebanon, you're registered by what religious community you belong to. The demonstrators don't want that. And what is interesting in both Lebanon and in Iraq, it's even more interesting because you would hear them chanting anti-American slogans, which you'd expect because the Americans occupied Iraq from 2003. But they're also saying Iran out, get rid of Iran. We don't want Iran dominating our politics. And so the Iranians, and I'll talk more about their role in Iraq when I talk about ISIS, because they get a real strong foothold in Iraq during the war against the Islamic State. Their group, which are called the Rached al-Sha'abi, the popular mobilization units, or the militias that are loyal to politicians that are loyal in turn to Iran, and in fact take their orders from Iran. And as I mentioned in the lecture I gave you about the politicization of Shia Islam, is that the New York Times had a really wonderful, in-depth article last fall based on, I think Europeans got the information. And anyway, it shows how that many of the people in the Iraqi government are basically meeting on a regular basis with operatives from Iran and taking their orders from Iran what to do. Well, this popular demonstration in Iraq is against that, and they're using the Iraqi flag. And initially, I had mentioned to you that Muqtada Sadr was a wild card in all this. Initially, Muqtada Sadr had said that his people could participate in the demonstrations. And so the demonstrations were non-sectarian. There were Sunnis and Shia. He then in December or January said, no, his people shouldn't participate. And that was during the time when the Americans, the Rached al-Sha'abi attacked the American embassy. That then they started chanting anti-American slogans. And so Muqtada Sadr never wanted to be associated. He said, well, if the Rached al-Sha'abi people are chanting anti-American slogans, I don't want to be on the side of the people that are chanting anti-Iran slogans. I'm not pro-American. So he kind of withdrew, but still, as far as we know, until the COVID virus hit them, the majority of the demonstrators were Shia, not Sunnis. So we have a unity of Sunni and Shia demanding a change in Iraq. And the prime minister did resign in Iraq. Similarly, in Lebanon, in Lebanon, the revolutionary movement had been called the Cedar Revolution. That came in 2005 after the Syrian secret police had assassinated the prime minister, Rafiq al-Hariri, because he was pushing for the Syrians to get out of Lebanon. He was, after his death, you had an alliance of Sunni Muslims, Druzes, and some of the Christians. The Christians split in half. Half the Christians went with what's called the Cedars movement, and the other half went with, allied themselves with Hezbollah. So that opened up in Lebanon, and that was this thing up through 2019. And then in 2019, young people got on the streets and they said, this is enough. We don't want this. We don't want this sectarianism. We don't like the corruption. We don't like the fact that to get a job in Lebanon, you have to be somehow be a patron. I mean, you have to be patronized by one of these political parties. There's too much corruption. We want, we want to open up our economy. We want to do this. And amazingly, more than 1 million people turn out of a population of 5 million. So it's a huge demonstrations in Beirut. Beirut was closed down all last fall by these demonstrations, and the Lebanese economy almost collapsed. And the prime minister did resign, although unfortunately for the Lebanese Lebanese people, the prime minister always has to be a Sunni. The president's always a Maronite Christian, and the prime minister is always a Sunni. But the one who they finally chose was one who is Hasan Diab, who is in the pocket of Hezbollah. He's not a Shia, but he relies on them. So as far as, again, the demonstrations in Lebanon closed down because of the virus, and we don't know what is happening. But what I see as sign of optimistic sign in both those two demonstrations is that the popular opinion is coming out. One, it's nationalist, that is, it's identifying with Lebanon as Lebanon, identifying with Iraq as Iraq. And it is, in both cases, it's for unity of all the different peoples living in those countries. And it's against these corrupt the institutions in both Lebanon and Iraq. They're the only two functioning democracies in the Arab world. And, but they're both corrupt, and they're also both sectarian. And so what the young people are asking for, and not just young people, it's also middle-aged in both countries, but in Iraq, it's more young. In Lebanon, it is the professional classes in Lebanon that are demanding change. That they're asking for, let's end the sectarianism. And we don't know it's hard to predict where that will go. But I actually see that as a little bit more optimistic. And I think that that should give you some hope that maybe the things will start to change in that part of the world. So I will end it there, and I will give the lecture that I will give next will be the last lecture. So I'll give you a little bit of information at that time about the final. So I guess that's all I have to say this morning. If you have any questions, please write to me and ask. I was asked about the lecture on the Shia politicization. I was asked several good questions. One of them was, did the fact that you had so-called moderates as presidents in the 90s, did that lead to a lessening of anti-Iranian feeling toward the United States, especially when the United States gets involved with the war with Iraq? And the answer is tragically no, because the presidents in Iraq really don't have much power. The supreme guide is Khamenei, and Khamenei very much remains anti-American. He calls America the Great Satan. So there'd be no way that the Iranians are happy. And I had Iranians tell me when I was there a couple of years ago, they were saying, well, we're so glad America destroyed Iraq, and that was our real enemy. So thank you, America. But the government's not going to say that. And as I said, the ordinary people on the street in Iran seem to be pretty pro-American anyway. But the government definitely is the voice of the government comes from Khamenei, and he is very much anti-American. Another good question I was asked is, does this politicization of the Shia Islam mean that there are more Shia than are people converting? And the answer is no. People in the Middle East tend to be what their parents were. There's very little conversion. And so what you have is the Shia are the majority in Iraq, and they are the largest minority. There is no majority in Lebanon. So they're the largest single group in Lebanon. And what has happened in both Lebanon and in Iraq is that they have found their political voice. They had been suppressed or ignored in the case of Lebanon, and suppressed in the case of Iraq. And they have found their voice. And I think they're still finding their voice. I think the fact that young people young Shia in Iraq and Lebanon are now looking for a secular answer to their problems is saying that maybe the moment that Iran planned so carefully to create this Shia coalition, it may be falling apart. I mean, it may be that in future that there is no Shia coalition, that the Shia who live in Lebanon and the Shia who live in Iraq will say, well, I have more in common with the Sunnis who live in Iraq, or the Sunnis and Christians who live in Lebanon, that I don't, why do I have anything in common with the Iranians? I mean, the Iranians, as I said, in Iraq have a real strong card in that there are Iraqi politicians that are in the pocket of the Iranians, and to some extent Hezbollah is in the pocket of the Iranians in Lebanon. But it is in both countries then a nationalist sentiment, whether it be Lebanese sentiment or Iraqi sentiment, would be one that would then counter the Iranians. So we'll have to see. So with that, I will leave it. And again, if you do have questions about this lecture, please write me. There is a lot of literature that came out about the Arab Spring, but of course, a lot of it came out during the time of the Arab Spring, so a lot of optimistic literature. I don't know of any study that's post facto that has looked at it very carefully. So if there is new literature coming out, I'm not aware of it, but clearly it needs a rethinking, because as I said, if you go back and look at the news reports from that time, it was incredibly optimistic. Most of the American TV stations, the regular ones like CBS, ABC, NBC, not to mention CNN, all had major correspondence in Cairo especially, but also in Tunis, even in Damascus before it got closed down. There were reports coming out fairly regularly from Damascus. But if you look in retrospect, you look back at all those, they really called it wrong. They really underestimated the power of the brothers in Egypt, and then the army in Egypt, and they really underestimated the extreme measures that the Syrians were willing to go to make sure that they stayed in power. So, and they also then underestimated the fact that in some ways the Arab Spring unleashed the whole Islamic State movement. So I'll talk more about the Islamic State movement in our next lecture. And as I said, I hope you're all staying well and healthy, and bye for now.